A Negroni is one of the great cocktail classics. In fact, it's celebrating its 100th birthday this year, when, as legend would have it, Count Camillo Negroni asked his bartender to add a drop of gin to his Americano. Folks are changing up ingredients all the time, and the Negroni has been tinkered with by creative bartenders trying their hand at redefining the basic recipe of vermouth, campari, and gin. Our guest today knew the native flavors he had in his backyard were crying out for attention, and he was going to be the one who answered their call. I can't say his original MO was to rework the Negroni per se, but the outcome of his pursuits have provided bartenders with a new spirit to play with. I'm Susan Schwartz, your drinking companion, and this is Lush Life Podcast. Every week, we are inspired to live life one cocktail at a time by the best in the industry. Eddie Brook's family had macadamia nuts on their mind when purchasing an old dairy farm in Byron Bay, an 8-hour drive north of Sydney. They discovered that they had landed in the region's largest subtropical rainforest, home to hundreds of Australia's native botanicals. After a childhood spent enjoying literally the fruits of his parents' labor, and a chance meeting with his idol, Jim McEwen, of Brook fame, Eddie established Byron Distillery, and the awards keep pouring in, especially for that one ingredient that gives his take on the Negroni a particularly Australian character. Why don't you tell me a little bit about your story and where you grew up?
Yeah, so our story sort of starts in different places. I'll start on our farm. So 30 years ago, my parents, Pam and Martin Brook, they're a bit crazy, but they're crazy in a good way. They purchased a complete rundown dairy farm in Byron Bay. Now, Byron Bay is on the east coast of Australia. Absolutely beautiful place. You know, a lot of people have heard about it or travelled there. Stunning beaches, pretty much all the stereotypical things about Australia, surf breaks. But they ended up purchasing this 95-acre, completely desolate, rundown landscape.
Wait, I have to just butt in there.
Yeah.
Now, why?
Exactly.
Why?
Well,
what were they doing before?
Well, I'll tell you the story. The story probably I shouldn't tell, but it's the good one. It's the real story. So mum and dad grew up in, we were living in Melbourne at the time. I wasn't even a thought at this stage. Now, mum was a dentist and dad was a film producer. Dad actually comes from Torquay, down here in Devon. And they had this idea. They always wanted to bring up their family around the country and around the sea. You know, the idea of this iconic sea change. That's what they wanted to do. So they were with their family friends. And, you know, you've got a friend that's always, you two get together and you just lead each other astray. So it was a dinner party that got led astray, let's say that. And after about, I'd say, the 5th or 6th bottle of wine, they decided to put a map of Australia up on the board. They blindfolded mum and they put a pin in the map of Australia. Now,
so they were already in Australia.
They were
having
Australia.
This conversation. Okay, so you moved from Torquay to Australia. Okay.
So we grew up there in Melbourne at the time. They put the pin in the map of Australia. Now, the story goes they hit the map the first time. Now, we're talking 5 or 6 bottles of wine in, where good ideas happen.
Alice Springs.
Alice Springs.
Oh, no,
it wasn't quite. They landed in a little place called Evans Head.
Okay.
So now that's on the east coast, about half an hour south. And after the hangovers wore off, the very next weekend, they packed their cars, drove there, and they ended up trying to find a place, and it didn't happen. But 2 weeks later, sight unseen, a real estate agent botched up an auction, and they ended up buying this 95 acres, completely sight unseen, of this rundown dairy farm. And that was the start of their sea change. So there's a lot of stories of serendipity. This idea is going to come in a few times. So they moved and packed up and went to Byron Bay. Now, where this sort of, where I suppose mum and dad's real passion comes from is when they started caring for the land and they started to find out what used to be there. And our region was part of the largest subtropical rainforest in Australia. It's known as the Big Scrub. Now, have you know the redwood forests in America?
Of course.
Yeah, these giant trees, 20
sequoias,
people. Yeah. Exactly, yeah. 20 people arm in arm. Now, we had a similar tree. It was called the red cedar. And this area, 75,000 hectares, about 100 years ago, just got wiped out, completely demolished. So much so only 1% remains. And I say to parents, they got the rainforest bug pretty early on. So our life has been spent regenerating and bringing this land back to life. So they actually, 30 years ago, they went to the bank after they'd already bought the land and they asked for a loan to plant 35,000 rainforest trees. Now, imagine going to your bank manager at the time. He'd be just thinking you're crazy.
Right.
But that's what we did. So that was my upbringing, rebuilding the land. So now our land is a thriving rainforest. With that, it's 5-fold increase in the amount of trees. The birds have returned. We've got echidna and wallaby and koala, platypus in the dam now. And we also plant macadamias. That's what we farm as well. So,
what was there ever? They bought a dairy farm. Did they think they were going to do dairy or have cows, or it was just that it was a farm? It
was going to be macadamias. Was always their first intention. So where we're from is called Northern Rivers in Australia. It's 200 million years ago. 20 million years ago, there was a mountain called Mount Warning, and it exploded, and lava spilled out all over our region. So that means we've got this really rich volcanic red soil. So perfect fertile soils, very subtropical climate too. And it's a perfect region for growing macadamias. So we're the actual second largest macadamia grown region now in Australia. So that's kind of where our family side of it comes from. But now you're thinking, right, from rainforest to, we've got bottles of gin in front of us. Where's the connection? And this comes from quite an interesting story of serendipity and where I got to meet my idol. So to put it lightly, Jim McEwen for me was one of the biggest influences of my life. Imagine you're a boxer and you got to meet Muhammad Ali. Now, I was managing the brands Brook and The Botanist in Australia at the time. And I was an ambassador for those brands prior. And how I learned to learn about those was watching YouTube videos of the great Jim McEwen, talking about this spirit. And when he talked about the spirit, it wasn't just, the product, the juice in the bottle. It was more than that. This was the lifeblood for his community. He talks about like the blood of Scotland. This stuff, helped that community survive. Farmers started growing barley again. The schools started to flourish. People got jobs on Isla, this tiny little community. And growing up as a farmer, I sort of connected really strongly with that. So I got to put a tour on for Jim McEwen in Australia. And I was jumping out of my boots. And I remember I was so nervous. I was shaking the first time I got to meet him. And I, orchestrated this 22-show sellout tour for Jim around the country. And, we're talking 100 people plus. Packing into auditoriums just to listen to the great man talk and tell stories. People connected with what he talks about because it's real, comes from the heart. And he's a rock star of the whiskey industry as well. So during this tour, we formed quite a friendship, and he's very much a family-driven kind of guy. And he asked me about my family, and I sort of explained what I was telling you before, that my family, we're crazy, but in a good way. Our life has been regenerating rainforests, but my passion growing up on the land has been around native flavors. And he was interested in that. And I said, Jim, you wouldn't believe what we have growing in our rainforest and in our region. You take aniseed, we have aniseed myrtle. Citrus, we've got finger lime. Cinnamon, we've got cinnamon myrtle. We've got strawberry gum, we've got Dorrigo pepper leaf. We've got all this stuff, which was, this is my backyard and I grew up with. And as the tour went on and, something incredible was happening, and he actually turned to me on one leg of the flight when I was telling him about these native flavors. And he said, Eddie, we were meant to meet and we're going to start this distillery. And I still bear scars from pinching myself slightly. But that's kind of the story about how we came to be. Now, my family, when we get a good idea, we hit the ground running. So,
wait, hold on.
Absolutely.
Before we get there, back on up. Because it is about you as well.
Absolutely.
Now, you were born into this quote-unquote crazy family, as you say, that is into regenerating forests. When you were growing up, did you feel that you wanted to continue this, the development of this? Were you going to take this in, and continue what your parents had started, or did you want to go off and do something else?
Yeah, it was a bit of a strange one. Like for me, my upbringing was, we used to work the farm, but also we started a food business. So it was called Brook Farm. So every day I'd come home from school, Mum would be baking different macadamia products, different mueslis and granolas. And it was that smell of roasted macadamia. I'd walk into the house. So the way we started our business, Mum was still working as a dentist and Dad was doing odds and ends. And we'd bake product during the week. I'd come home from school, we'd bag it, I'd put labels on, it was a whole family in together. And then come the weekends, we'd go to the markets, pack the car full, and we'd go sell our product and talk about what we do. And that was just my upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of people say, geez, that must be crazy. But, I used to sleep next to muesli boxes. That was just our family. It could be worse. Yeah.
And how about the love of spirits?
Well, the love of spirits, very early on, my family, it's always been appreciation of product. And Mum in particular has been a Scotch whiskey fiend. I think I have, there was a thimbleful of Scotch probably on my dummy when I was a little one. But I grew up in that food industry, in that culinary world. And that quickly evolved into when I started uni, I found that creative output. I was working as, in kitchens behind bars. So I started my career as a cocktail bartender, and I, went out to work with the best people in our region. This is in Brisbane in Australia, the likes of, Marco Nunez from Canvas. And I learned so much from these people. I was a sponge. And I just was fascinated by the industry. But more so, I fell in love with, I remember the first time I got to see a brand ambassador talk about a product. I was like, wow, how cool is that? And I connected with them telling and sharing stories. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of where, it was about 4 or 5 years in the cocktail industry, worked in managing bars and doing cocktail list development. And I just love that output. So that led me into a career as an ambassador for products, in Brisbane, such as Buffalo Trace, beautiful, beautiful bourbon, and, Brook Laddie, and we did Heyman's Gin, and these great products and these great stories, and, they come from real places, from real people making the product.
So when did you think it was time to start telling your story?
Well,
was it meeting Jim?
It was pretty much meeting Jim. For me, in my cutting through life, growing up with a family business, we've got a great first family business, 100% family owned. We employ now 70 people in our local community and area. And I always knew one day that I wanted to be a part of that business. But when I did, I wanted to bring something to the business rather than having something to learn from. So I wanted to cut my own path and then, bring something, because we're going to be, our end goal is to be generational, this family business. So it's about the long-term goal.
Just like the rainforest.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was that story, and it's quite funny. You don't know when things happen, but it was that culmination of, maybe my upbringing, that food industry, growing up and working the farm, understanding native products, and wanting to always. We had a crazy idea prior to this about, why don't we do a distillery? But it's one of those ideas, you just put it on the shelf, but it's there. It's always in the back of your head.
Were you thinking making things out of macadamia nuts or whiskey, gin?
Well, we were originally...
When it was an idea?
Originally we were thinking whiskey, but for me I'm very passionate about our native flavours coming from our land. So I wanted it to be around that. Mm-hmm. Now, to have an idea around product is one, but then to be able to balance it out into a spirit is a whole different kettle of fish. And that's where Jim comes in, the man and the way his palate works. And, he's 53, 54 years in the spirit industry, 15 years started as a cooper kicking barrels. And what that man doesn't know about whiskey, it's not worth knowing, or about spirit production, because he knows it all. So that's when we evolved and started the process about building the recipe. I brought all my knowledge of flavors, and I was lucky enough to be mentored and trained by Jim in the art of distillation, and that's really where the product came to life, and which is a pretty exciting part to it. Brookie's Gin is the culmination and really two worlds coming together. It's our family's work and life we've done with regenerating and, my upbringing around native food and flavors and really just having a passion for it and showcasing that, combining with probably the most knowledgeable man in the spirit industry today. And what he fell in love with was, it's more than us just creating a product. Jim and what we believe in is, creating product, but also doing it in a way that has a positive impact on our environment and also our community. That's what it's about. And that spirit, what you're tasting there, that showcases what we've done on our farm. This started 30 years ago. This bottle right here, this isn't an overnight thing.
Okay, well, back to you and meeting Jim.
Yes.
So did he actually come and visit your farm?
He did. So this idea came about, and during that, that trip, I remember I hopped off that plane and I called Mum and Dad, Pam and Martin, and I said, guys, you have to come to Tasmania, which is the last leg of the trip. Something incredible is going on. And, they had this belief, and, it's just in a way our crazy family goes. So they did. They came to Tasmania. We had our first official, whatever you want to call it, company meeting. And we sat down in a cafe in Hobart, and this idea started coming to life. It grew foundations. So Jim went back to Isla, and we, got back to the farm. I put in my resignation with South Trade, didn't tell a soul. This was the biggest secret in my life I think I've ever kept. I couldn't tell anyone yet. And we started building the distillery. And, after we built the distillery, or, a month before we finished it, Jim flew over. So our still, which is a 2,000 litre beautiful copper pot still handmade for us in Tasmania by a mad German called Peter Bailey. And, it's that fine art of, form and function. It's just beautiful, so attentive to details. And as that still was getting put to, getting built in the distillery and commissioned, we started work on the recipe. So,
and was this the recipe for your first gin?
This is the recipe for our Brookies, our Byron Dry Gin.
Okay.
Our signature gin. This was going to be the pillars of what we were starting with and what we stand for.
But always with a view to the future of making whiskey?
No.
Oh.
Funnily enough, a lot of people do. A lot of people...
Only because you're talking about gin.
Yeah, it's so funny. Now, when we did it, for us, what we do on the land and what we do with native flavors, that story was going to get told through our gin. And, to be honest, Jim has done his work like beyond anything in the world of with whiskey. And our intention was always just to do gin.
Okay.
So we actually, our copper pot still called George, we had it custom made purely for making, what was going to be gin. We installed in the line arm of the still, a botanical basket. That was where we were going to fill all of our native ginger into the still. But apart from that, it's a perfect Scottish pot still shape. So it wasn't until January this year that we only even started whiskey. And we've been going 3 years now. So especially for the first year and a half, for us, it was all about gin. And there was always that idea, like I've always been intrigued by the world of whiskey and been a lover of it, and I've done a lot of ambassador work with it. And there is something quite magical around that spirit. As Jim talks about it, when a spirit is produced, a child is born, and that child goes to its mother, a cask. And depending on how much life that mother has to give that child and the environment that it evolves in and grows up in, is going to impact and give character to that spirit. And there's something quite magical about it. You can't help but get swept up in that. But our intent was always to do gin. But as we ticked along, we realized, we're not distilling every single day with this gin, with this still. We've got large shoes to fill. So we kind of, mulled over this idea, and I chat with Jim fairly often, and he was like, well, let's put this still back to work. Let's do it. So,
well, back to gin.
Back to
the gin first.
Absolutely.
Then. So you wanted to create the flavors of your home farm in your gin.
Absolutely.
Obviously, you have to use juniper
Yep.
to be gin. What else were you thinking of throwing in?
So, juniper and coriander are the backbone really of gin. We don't grow juniper in Australia where, cold climate is generally the temperature it grows in. Now, cold climate in Australia don't really fit too well. We've got definite areas, but we don't have a farming background, our nation, in growing juniper. So we bring it over from, places like Macedonia and Hungary and some from Italy. But for us, when you take a step back and you look at the flavor profile of what we have growing in our region, it's called Northern Rivers, our region in the Byron Bay region, and it's home to the most amount of subtropical fruits, native fruits and flavors grown in our country. So I'm going to paint a little picture for you in a flavor wheel. In terms of gin, you normally obviously got juniper, coriander, but then you've got citrus is a part of it. Then almost like tea-like or bitter notes coming into it. And then you've got a sense of floral coming into it as well. And you also need some dryness in there as well. Now, if you take a step back, take away those traditional flavors, and you looked at the wheel of Australian native flavors, we've got that. So citrus, we've got 80 different varieties growing in our region of finger limes. We've got desert limes. We've got this cross-pollinated citrus called blood lime. They took a finger lime and a mandarin, a variety, got those together. We've got a little berry coming off the tree called white aspen berry. This tastes like lemon lime sorbet. That's just citrus alone. Then you go into tea-like characteristics. Mint. We've got native river mint. We've got cinnamon myrtle and aniseed myrtle and Dorigo pepper leaf. It's like Earl Grey meets a Szechuan pepper. Floral. We've got a Banksia flower that smells like honeysuckle. We've got fresh lily pilly leaves and that bitterness and dryness. We've got native thyme, and the flavor's all there, So for what we wanted to do, our idea was bring together, traditional and native flavors and lay them in together and balance them into a beautiful gin. That's
a lot of choice there that you're describing. It must have been really tough to choose. How long did the whole process take?
It is, well, it is and it isn't. So there's way more, for instance, I'll give you one example, like lemon myrtle. Lemon myrtle's probably Australia's most well-known, or one of most well-known bush foods. Very high in citronella, but it is such a powerful flavor. And the way I sort of talk about it is, if you had brought a room together of 15 of your dear friends, everyone has a friend like lemon myrtle. Now, lemon myrtle stands out. You're not going to get away from it, but it's beautiful. Like, there's a lot of great Australian gins that balance it in so well. That just wasn't going to be our personality. So for the amount we used, there's an even bigger list we didn't even use. The world of Australian native flavors is almost beyond comprehension with what we've got here. But it was all about coming back to balance. And I talk about those different flavor regions: citrus, tea-like, floral, and the anise, and they all need to play a part. So this is where Jim came to Australia, and it was a pretty packed in time period, but we had Jim was here for 5 weeks, and we set about creating our recipes. Now, prior to Jim arriving, I'd already distilled and worked on a lot of those native flavors and understood how they distilled through, very different from just eating them straight. So we set to work. So the first step was to bring Jim into our world. The man knows native, traditional botanicals like you wouldn't believe. He created the botanist gin. Right. He obviously knows his way around, and he knows how to balance flavors. So we brought him into our world of native flavors. So the only way to do that is immerse him.
Right.
So we went into the rainforest, into the bush. Actually, I might tell you a funny story if you don't mind.
No, that's what we're here for.
Yeah, exactly.
Stories.
Yeah. So Jim's known as the rainforest. Oh, sorry. Jim's known as the cask whisperer. He does that because in the halls of Brook or Bowmore, where he was master distiller, he believes that spirit is more than just product in a cask. There's something spiritual going on, and you'd be out talking to casks. Hey, how you doing? How was winter? How's your staves? You're looking all right so far. And on the flip side of that, Jim actually named him the Rainforest Whisperer. And he did that because he's crazy, similar to Jim in a good way. He truly believes there is much more than those trees growing. There's something there's a connection. You can't help but when you go into a great rainforest, you feel something. Now,
he named all those 35,000 trees.
Exactly.
They all have a name.
And he's got his favorite ones. He'll go in there, and he always go, and there's this beautiful tree that's it's a large blue fig that's getting wrapped by a strangler fig, and it is just incredible. But he has all these favorite trees. So anyway, that's Dad. He's out chatting to the trees, the birds. So
you have two whisperers.
Right? You can imagine. It's like the start of a bad joke. So we had day one was bringing Jim into our world of native flavors, and we set off into the rainforest. So you got the rainforest whisperer, Dad. I'm behind him. And then the cast whisperer, and we're heading into the rainforest. Yeah. And we get to this one patch in the rainforest. It's fairly early on. This is in spring. Perfect, beautiful time on the orchard. And everything's coming to life. So we're in this one patch, imagine about sort of 3 meters wide, dense rainforest. And we're picking native raspberries straight from the bush. We've got white aspen coming straight from the trees. We've got cinnamon myrtle flowering, and this smell of honeysuckle cinnamon coming off, and aniseed myrtle and ryeberries coming off. Now, one thing we didn't quite realise, and this is in Jim's mind, is he thought you could eat absolutely everything. No, yeah, you kind of know where this is going. So here's Jim, got a mouthful of this, and this is stuff we're giving him. And, kind of a rule of thumb, if you don't know what you're eating, if it looks like a ripe berry, probably steer away from it. Anyway,
especially in Australia, where everything can kill you.
Exactly. So after this little area, Dad goes, right, we're off again. And we didn't think too much about it. So rainforest whisperer, me, cast whisperer, and we've headed in. And Dad's 5 minutes in, we've been walking, and Dad's telling stories about the trees, his birds, and the bird song's just incredible. And Dad's getting carried away. Anyway, after a little while, we turned around and we've both stopped, and our jaws has dropped.
What he's munching.
He has got berries and leaves and everything coming out of his mouth, and we were thinking, oh my God.
We've killed Jim. Yeah, we've killed him.
You could see the frontline newspaper on Isla, or, Red Spirit Industry, rainforest whisperer poisons cast whisperer in Byron Bay. But thankfully, he was all right. He had a pretty upset tummy, but it's quite funny. Anyway, so what I was getting at before I got carried away was bringing him into our world. So he had to understand native flavors. So the native raspberry, the aniseed myrtle, the cinnamon myrtle, and understanding those flavors, just like he did with the botanist on Isla. And then once he had that understanding, we really set to work on the recipe. Mm-hmm. And for us, it's all about balance. A lot of these flavors are quite powerful, but, if you balance them in right, they'll make those flavors completely pop and burst open. And one flavor in particular we use, which sounds a bit strange, but is macadamia, ground macadamia. Mm-hmm. So when you distill all those flavors through, a lot of oil comes through, you're after that oil. And macadamia comes through and gives this butteriness and oiliness and a beautiful sort of mouthfeel to our gin, which is very different. So we had one problem though. We knew all of our native ginger was going in the line arm. Now, a traditional pot still, 2,000 litres. We did all those, we built that raft of botanicals, your juniper, your coriander, your cinnamon, our native citrus. But we had all this soft native flavour. And if we put it in the belly of the still, it was just going to get beaten up and lost. We put it in the basket, we didn't have any more room up there, so we couldn't do that. So Jim came up with this idea, only Jim could, and he called it Babylon bags. And put this in your mind's eye, the hanging gardens of Babylon, mists and vapors passing through these gardens, and that's what we wanted to recreate. So we welded hooks at the start of the neck of the still, and inside the pot still, we hang and put all of those native flavors in our Babylon bags, 3 different bags. So they hang suspended, not in the liquid above. Right. So when we distill, they infuse through vapor. So you've got all the flavors in the belly of the still, Babylon bags infusing through vapor, and then the native ginger getting passed through vapor. And that's how we make our Brookie's Byron Dry Gin.
And how long did it take from concept to having a bottle?
It was, from concept to bottle was all in all, the recipe.
Well, really, I guess recipe to bottle.
After I'd distilled, it was about probably a 6-month time period, but it was all doing balancing those flavors. I'd send ones to Jim back and forth, but it was 5 weeks we had to nail this recipe out.
While he was there.
So we had the clock ticking. Like we'd go, 14 hours a day, non-stop, working on recipes, coming up with, ideas. So,
did you have the eureka moment in that time, during that time?
We did, and it's a moment. That you have these moments in life you'll never forget. Now, it was the first time we work our recipe. Now, to do it on a small still is one thing, but to take it into a larger still, you almost have this. You're venturing into the unknown. Going where no man's gone before. There's a lot of unknown with that scaling a recipe, and when that spirit ran, when we made that cut, it was just the family in the distillery, Jim and I, and there was not a dry eye. There was just elation. There was, this is the spirit. This is our distillery. This is our family business that was born. So it was a pretty special and powerful moment, and one that definitely I'll hold on to for the rest of my life.
I'm sure. Now you also have your slow gin and your Mac.
We do indeed.
So tell me a little bit about how those started as well.
Yeah, so our slow gin was our second product we brought to market. Now
I'm just going to say it's SLOW, so it's not slow gin, it's something different.
Exactly. Now we realised we brought a lot of things to Australia. Education, it seems, wasn't one of them, and we're not very good at spelling. I joke around because we do this for a reason. In Australia, we don't really grow slow berries. We do have very small growth in Tasmania, and they're not native, they're brought over. Very much a cold climate crop. But what we do have is this incredible fruit called the Davidsonia plum. Now, this fruit only grows in the region of Northern Rivers. This is its home. Millions of years it's lived here. And the fruit is incredible. Nothing like you've ever seen before. The tree looks like a tree out of a Dr. Seuss book. It grows 20 feet high. It wears a top hat of leaves and has a thin trunk, and the fruit grows straight off the inside of the trunk. No arms come off it. But the fruit's incredible. So similar to the slowberry, it just lacks marzipan and bitter notes to it, which is, I'm okay with that. Yeah. So I wanted to take, and my concept was to do a purely native Australian take on the classic English slow gin. So we do it all in the same style. So we first freeze our Davidson plums. We get them once a year. We grow about 600 kilos a year. We're putting in a lot more trees in a separate area. But we get them from small farmers and growers in our region. And then we freeze them and the skin's split open. Then we steep those Davidson plums straight into our spirit, our Byron dry gin we were just talking about. And then it rests and ages. And it ages up to takes on average 10 months to produce one bottle. And what happens when that fruit ages and spends time resting and evolving, you get flavors of almost like port or jammy notes, and you get sort of muscatel and raisins, and all these flavors start to come to life. And then we balance it just with introducing, we grow a lot of cane in our region. So we get a very raw, unrefined cane sugar, and that's it. Very natural product, but again, showcasing our rainforest. And so it's pretty fun. It's been turning some heads just recently. The dry gin was won a gold medal at the San Francisco 3 years in a row, which is massive. World Spirits Comp, and the SIP Awards awarded our Byron Slow Gin, our Brookie Slow Gin, a platinum. And it was quite funny. When we got awarded the platinum, this is about 6 months ago, we didn't have enough stock. So we can't keep up with this because, we don't even sell to large retailers in Australia because it goes to our, local retailers, bottle shops, independent bars, and they love that unique. Everyone's falling in love with the flavor. So if we told people about the medal, we were thinking more people are just going to want it. And we can't do that because we're going to let everyone else down that wants it already, So we held off for 6 months telling the world about it. But
Now you shout about it.
Now we shout about it. We're only just getting enough, but not a lot.
Now the mac, which
mac.
I'm sure is really dear to your heart.
Absolutely.
Because talk about native flavors.
Yeah.
And macadamia, obviously. Mac as a macadamia.
That's it.
So why did you decide to create that?
So growing up, I'll go back to where we started with Brook Farm. Every single day, we've got just over 3,000 macadamia trees on our property. It's what we do. We farm macadamias. And, my upbringing, every day I come home from school, when I was about 10 years old, Mum would have about six to eight different products she's been working on, roasting and macadamias. And that smell of roasted macadamias is like, it's so nostalgic for me. And it's almost like the smell of baked bread. You get that warming hug on the inside. You can't help but smile. So I wanted to recreate and I wanted to showcase our native Australian, bushnut, macadamia. So this is a liqueur and it's a heavily roasted macadamia and wattle seed liqueur. And for me, I wanted to show depth of flavor to the macadamia. So we first take the nut, and we are using ovens, our hand-roasted ovens. So we roast them in a big trays, and we roast them always till they're too bitter to taste. And it's almost, if you ever imagine, toasting pine nuts in a pan, there's that fine moment. If you don't toast them enough, they're okay, but they're not that flavor you're after. You get the sweet spot, but that sweet spot to burnt is very close, and that's the margin we play in. But second to that, we also look at a part of the macadamia that's never been used. It's the shell, the hard shell.
Oh. I don't even think I've ever seen a shell.
No, they're like, okay, so imagine, I'll paint it in your mind's eye. So the macadamia grows off a tree, and on the outer of it, you've got a husk. It's kind of like, almost like a coconut husk, but a little softer. And then inside that, you have a very, very hard shell, like hard as a rock. If you threw it at a window, it'd break it. Then inside that hard shell is the kernel or the nut, the macadamia nut.
And that's what we usually eat.
That's the one. So the hard shell has a lot of flavor in it, but it's very hard to extract, or people always overlook it. So I went to our processor and I asked them to do something they'd never done before, which was make it food grade. So they cooked it for a long period of time, pasteurizing it, and that drew out all the moisture, removed all the bacteria, and when that shell hits spirit and macerates or steeps for about 3 months, you get flavors of butterscotch and toffee. Oh, boy. It is incredible.
I think you're the first person probably to ever realize this.
Well, yeah, you got to be a bit crazy. I think I always, I've always grown up with always asking why or what if, or why not, And these are the questions I think you got to ask if you're going to create something. But then we use wattle seed. And wattle seed is one of my favourite Australian bush flavours. Best way to describe it, so it's a seed, grows off a tree called the acacia tree, and it's very popular in Australia. It's actually on one of our notes. You'll see this beautiful, vibrant sort of yellow flower. But the seed, when you roast it, becomes bush coffee. It tastes like beautifully dark roasted coffee meets dark chocolate and almost like roasted semi-burnt popcorn. It's just incredible. And those are our flavors.
And can you eat the seed by itself?
You can. You do need to roast it. It is best roasted, but the flavor is incredible. If you dusted that over espresso martini, you could even use it purely just as coffee, and it looks like coffee grounds when it's roasted. And
to bring those two together, was that completely your idea, to bring the macadamia and the seed together?
Yeah, it was because, the macadamia is so buttery. It's got this inherent sweetness about it, and especially the flavor we got from it. And we needed a bit of bitterness too there as well. It's just like, I suppose it goes back to almost creating a drink, balancing out a drink. I needed those flavors in there. And I don't know, I've just had those flavor memories, tucked away, and automatically I knew it was going to be wattle seed. I knew those flavors were going to work. So it took me about 12 months to get that recipe right and balance. It's about extracting flavors at different alcohol levels, but it's simple. You look at that color here, it's this beautiful golden, dark, rich, almost mahogany color. Now, we don't use any coloring. We never will. We don't use any flavorings, any essences, never will. This is purely coming from the macadamia and the wattle seed.
And it's gorgeous.
Yeah.
Now back to the whiskey.
Yes.
So when did you start putting it in barrels?
So we only started, what month are we now? So we started in February, the 11th of February, 2019 was the very first barrel we filled.
So it hasn't come out yet?
Hasn't come out yet, not at all.
So in a few years...
In a few years, we've got two slightly different rules and regulations in Australia, not too far gone. Barrel or whiskey, to be whiskey, has to be in a barrel for 2 years in an oak cask, oak vessel. And the other one is where we get a little bit more flexibility. To be a single malt whiskey, you have to create your own wash on site. Now, in Australia, that's not the case. So we get this slight flexibility into how we can approach production and spirit. And it just so happens our dear family, friends, and in our community is Australia's far and away number one premium craft independent beer called Stone & Wood. Now, these guys are incredible. Not only do they produce great beer, but at the heart and soul of what they do is all about their community. And they wanted to create a community brewery. So we worked with them. Some dear friends, Brad, the head brewer in particular, he was so excited. He was almost more excited about we were about creating this new chapter of our distillery. And we set to work on creating our wash. So we use a beautiful Australian pale malt barley. And then we use yeast strains. One in particular is a classic traditional one used for Scotch whiskey. But then we played around with the second one, which as far as I know, has never been used for the making of spirit before. It's normally used in the beer industry for some more almost sort of lighter style beers, more sort of sour style beers. And what we do, the ester profile we got off it is this huge pear and lychee and almost pineapple skin note purely coming off that ester profile. But the oiliness we get from that spirit is just beautiful. And, Jim's not one to ever tell a tale. When that spirit ran, and we nosed it, and we've been producing that spirit ever since. He said, hand on heart, that this is one of the finest spirits he's ever been a part of. So it's pretty incredible. It's great start for us. We're going into full size American oak casks, but then again, it comes back to our environment. That spirit of Brook, and on spirit aged on Islay, good spirit that's aged on Islay properly. Those barrels living on Islay, they're experiencing that same. You've got wind and all that lashing against it. When Byron, where the rainforest meets the sea, you've got this huge salinity in the air, but we've got this coolness running in the rainforest as well. So our barrels are working a lot harder than over here in the UK. So we get a lot faster maturation. It's about 1.8 times as quick. So a 2.5-year-old in Australia will be around a 4-year-old there. So it's early days for us, but it's an exciting new chapter for what we're doing as a distillery.
Well, you've made me thirsty. Should we go try some?
I think we should.
Thanks so much to Eddie, who stopped by on his whistle-stop tour of Europe to share his story. If you live in the UK, you can find Brookie's Gin, Slow Gin, and Mac at the Whiskey Exchange or the Masters of Malt. All you Americans and anyone else, beg your friends from the UK and Australia to bring you a bottle. Aussies, you have it easy. It's right in your backyard. Back to the Negroni. After the success of the cocktail, the Negroni family founded a Negroni-making distillery and bottled it. The Distilleria Negroni still exists today. One of its most famous fans was Orson Welles, who claimed they were good for you. He thought the bitters helped your liver, but he also agreed that the gin is not so great for your liver, and that they balanced each other out. I'm not sure where that leaves us. Brookie's has added just one new ingredient to the standard Negroni recipe, and you can find that in this week's Cocktail of the Week. The Slow Groni has the best of both worlds, the old and the new. The traditional gin, campari, and vermouth. But this time the gin is Brookie's, and the additional ingredient is the Byron Slow Gin that Eddie described. All you have to do is keep the proportions exact and stir it, no shaking. So add 30 mLs of Brookie's Byron Dry Gin and 15 mLs of Brookie's Byron Slow Gin and 30 mLs of Campari and 15 mLs of premium vermouth, all over ice in a mixing glass, and stir it until chilled. Then strain it over an ice-filled glass. Garnish it with an orange slice or some zest. Close your eyes and dream about being on the porch of the distillery overlooking the Australian rainforest. You'll find this recipe and more Negroni recipes, plus all the cocktails of the week at alushlifemanual.com, where you'll also find all the ingredients in our shop. I hated Negronis the first time I tasted one, even though I love Campari. But it took one visit to Bar Termini in London to teach me a thing or two. They have 4 different expressions of Negronis, which you can try in small Nick and Nora glasses, and the staff is on hand to teach you the ins and out of the Negroni. I tried all 4, and I think I was converted that night. I wish I had known about Negronis when I was living in Florence in the 1980s. Cafe Giacosa, where the cocktail was invented, was my local coffee place. Just like Cova in Milan and Cafe Greco in Rome, Giacosa was a 200-year-old wonder of gold and marble, one of the most beautiful coffee houses in Italy. How it was sold off to Roberto Cavalli at the turn of this century and finally closed to make room for his boutique, I think, is an embarrassment. You can still find photos of the original Giacosa online. If you want to talk more about Giacosa, Florence, Negronis, or Cape Byron Distillery, go to flick.group/lushlife. It's free to join and works on Android or iOS devices. Plus, you can listen to the latest episodes right there if you want to catch up. If you live for Lush Life, would you consider supporting us by buying us a coffee? Just go to buymeacoffee.com/lushlife. And you can donate once or monthly to make sure we are here still every Tuesday. Theme music for Lush Life is always by Steven Shapiro and used with permission. And Lush Life is always and will be forever produced by Evo Terra and Simpler Media Productions. Which leaves me to say the wise words of Oscar Wilde, all things in moderation, including moderation, and always drink responsibly. Okay, the second part was mine. In the forthcoming episode, we will go from down under to lower ground floor to meet the owner of one of London's temples of rum and one of the best bars in the world. Until next time, bottoms up.